Serwaa slept peacefully, dreaming of the wedding that would change her life.
But while she dreamed, we must strike now. Her own mother and sister were destroying her future. She won't suspect a thing.
Let me see how you will get married before your sister. She will never get married before me.
You will never get married before my daughter.
The flames consumed the wedding gown, the gown that was supposed to carry Serwaa into the arms of her husband.
This is the story of a girl who never asked for much, who never demanded love, only hoped to receive it. This is the girl who was never loved.
Many years before the wedding that almost never happened, Ya and Amma were known throughout their small community as a loving, devoted couple. They were not the richest people around, but they were rich in something far harder to buy: genuine happiness. They laughed together over simple meals, worked side by side building their small trade, and lay awake many nights dreaming aloud about the day their modest home would finally echo with the laughter of children running through its narrow hallways. Every year, they hoped for good news. Every year, disappointment arrived instead, quiet and merciless. 1 year became 2. 2 became 5, and 5 stretched painfully into more years than either of them wished to count. The child they longed for with their whole hearts never came. They visited hospital after hospital, sitting in crowded waiting rooms filled with the cries of other people's babies, a cruel reminder of what remained just out of their reach. They spent what little savings they had on tests, treatments, and traditional remedies suggested by well-meaning relatives. Each time, they sat across from a doctor's desk, hands clasped tightly together, waiting nervously for answers that might finally explain the silence in their home. Yet the doctors always offered the same gentle, unsatisfying words. There is nothing medically wrong with either of you. Be patient. Keep trying. Patience, however, grows heavier with every passing year until it begins to feel less like a virtue and more like a punishment. Outside the walls of the hospital, the pressure only intensified. Relatives whispered behind Amma's back at family gatherings, their voices dropping just low enough to seem discreet, yet loud enough to wound. Some didn't bother whispering at all. What is the use of a marriage without children? One aunt remarked openly during a wedding reception, swirling her drink as though she hadn't just delivered a blade to Amma's chest. Another woman laughed lightly and suggested, perhaps Ya should simply find himself a second wife who can give him what he truly needs. Every careless word landed like a fresh wound layered over old scars that had never properly healed. Family celebrations, once a source of joy, slowly transformed into quiet torment. Whenever someone arrived at a gathering cradling a newborn, Amma forced a polite smile onto her face while something inside her chest quietly cracked further. At night, once the house fell silent and Ya's breathing evened into sleep, she would often sit alone in the darkness of their small living room and cry until her throat ached. Sometimes Ya would wake to find the space beside him empty, and he would find her there, tears tracing silent paths down her face in the moonlight. He would sit beside her without a word at first, simply taking her hand in his. "Amma, please don't do this to yourself," he would whisper softly. "One day, everything will be fine. I believe that." But Amma would only shake her head, her voice raw with exhaustion. "You say that every year, Ya. How much longer must I wait? How many more years of my life will slip away while I wait for a miracle that refuses to come?" One particularly painful night, after returning from yet another gathering filled with thinly veiled insults and mocking laughter, Amma finally broke down completely. She sat on the edge of their bed, shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Ya rushed to her side immediately, alarmed by the depth of her grief. "Amma, what happened? Talk to me," he pleaded. Through the tears streaming down her face, she looked up at him with an expression he had never seen before. Not sadness, but something closer to exhaustion mixed with quiet desperation. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "I am tired of the pity in people's eyes. I am tired of the whispers that follow me into every room. I am tired of pretending, every single day, that I am strong enough to carry this." Ya remained silent, waiting, sensing there was more she needed to say. "Please," "Ya," she continued, her voice trembling. "Let us adopt a child. I don't care where the child comes from. I don't care about blood or bloodlines. I just want someone to call my own. I want, more than anything in this world, to finally be a mother." Ya lowered his head, the weight of her request settling heavily on his shoulders. The suggestion was not entirely new between them. They had spoken about it in passing before, but he had always privately hoped they would eventually conceive a child of their own blood. For several long moments, he said nothing at all, wrestling silently with his own quiet grief. Finally, he lifted his eyes to meet his wife's tearful gaze. "If this will make you happy," he said softly, "then we will do it, together." Amma threw her arms around him and wept even harder than before. But this time, the tears carried something different. Relief. Hope. The first genuine light she had felt in years. Soon after that quiet, tearful night, Ya and Amma began carefully making arrangements. To avoid the endless questions and gossip that would surely follow, Amma made the difficult decision to pretend she was pregnant. For 9 long months, she carefully maintained the illusion, wearing loose, flowing clothing, avoiding situations that might expose the truth, practicing her lines whenever curious relatives asked how she was feeling. Then, after those 9 anxious months finally passed, a beautiful baby girl entered their lives, delivered into their arms through the quiet, private arrangements they had made. They named her Serwaa. The moment Ya first held the tiny infant, something shifted permanently inside him. He stared down at her small, peaceful face and felt his heart swell with an emotion he hadn't fully expected. "She is beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "She is absolutely perfect." Amma's happiness returned almost instantly, flooding back into their home like sunlight after a long, gray season. For the first time in years, genuine laughter filled their small house once again. They loved Serwaa with their whole hearts and raised her as though she had been born from their own bodies, because in every way that mattered, she had become their daughter. Then something remarkable began to unfold. Not long after Serwaa joined their small family, Ya's modest trading business began growing at a pace neither of them could have predicted. New opportunities seemed to appear from nowhere. Contracts that had once seemed impossible were suddenly approved. Investments that once felt like distant dreams began to succeed one after another. Money flowed into their household in ways they had never dared to imagine. Ya often joked, half in wonder and half in genuine belief, "This little girl brought luck into our lives." Deep down, he truly believed every word of it. Their family grew happier than they had ever been. Everywhere Serwaa went, smiles seemed to follow in her wake. She became, without anyone deciding it consciously, the warm center of their entire world. Years passed peacefully in this way, until one ordinary morning when Amma rushed into the living room with tears streaming down her face. Ya immediately rose in alarm. "Amma, what's wrong?" he asked urgently. She handed him a small piece of paper, her hands trembling visibly. As he read it, his eyes widened in stunned disbelief. "You're pregnant!" he shouted, the words tumbling out of him in pure astonishment. Amma nodded through fresh tears, though this time they were unmistakably tears of overwhelming joy. Ya lifted her off her feet and spun her in a circle, laughing with an abandon neither of them had felt in years. "After all these years!" he shouted toward the ceiling, as though the ancestors themselves needed to hear his gratitude. "After all these years!" The news spread quickly through their small community. Family gathered to celebrate. Friends offered congratulations that finally felt sincere rather than pitying. Months later, Amma gave birth to a second beautiful baby girl. They named her Dela. Ya looked between his 2 daughters and smiled with unmistakable pride, holding baby Dela gently while young Serwaa stood curiously beside him, peering down at her new sister. "Now we have 2 daughters," he said warmly. "Our family is finally complete." At first, everything seemed genuinely, wonderfully perfect. Both girls were loved. Both girls were cared for with equal tenderness. Both girls filled the house with the kind of joyful chaos that only children can create. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something quietly began to change beneath the surface of their happy home. As Dela grew older, Amma found herself becoming increasingly attached to her biological daughter, a pull she hadn't fully anticipated and struggled, at first, to even name. What began as small, seemingly insignificant differences soon hardened into patterns too consistent to ignore. Amma would return from the market with expensive gifts for Dela, while offering little more than a passing glance towards Serwaa. If Dela made a mistake, Amma excused it instantly, brushing it aside with gentle laughter. If Serwaa made the very same mistake, she was met with sharp scolding. Yaa noticed the shift and tried, more than once, to intervene. One evening, he sat beside his wife with a heavy heart. "Amma, you are treating the girls differently," he said carefully. Amma frowned, her arms crossing defensively. "What exactly do you mean?" "I mean precisely what I said. Serwaa notices it. I notice it. You are showing clear favoritism, and it's only getting worse." "Dela is my daughter," Amma replied flatly, as though the statement alone justified everything. Yaa stared at her, genuinely stunned by the coldness in her voice. "And what, then, is Serwaa to you?" Amma looked away, unable, or unwilling, to answer. The situation only worsened as the years passed. One evening, during a heated argument that had started over something trivial, Amma said something that left Yaa utterly speechless. "Maybe," she said, her voice eerily calm, "we should take Serwaa back." "Take her back where?" Yaa demanded, disbelief creeping into his voice. "The orphanage," Amma said simply, as though suggesting they return a piece of furniture that no longer suited their home. Yaa shot to his feet, fury blazing in his eyes. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he shouted. "That child has lived in this house for years. She calls us mother and father. She knows no other family." Amma remained stubbornly unmoved. Dela should come first. Both girls should come first. Yaa fired back, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "They are both our daughters, equally." But Amma refused to listen, retreating instead into a cold silence that would linger between them for days. As the years continued passing, Serwaa slowly began noticing the painful differences that everyone around her seemed determined to pretend didn't exist. Dela received beautiful new clothes, expensive gifts wrapped in glossy paper, and endless streams of praise for even the smallest accomplishments. Serwaa, meanwhile, was expected to clean, cook, and manage most of the household chores without complaint. Whenever guests visited, Amma proudly paraded Dela before them like a prized possession, while Serwaa quietly worked in the background, unseen and unacknowledged. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after her chores were finally finished, Serwaa would sit alone and wonder, with a child's aching confusion, why everything felt so unevenly divided. She loved her parents deeply, but she could not understand why her mother's warmth seemed to stop just short of reaching her. One evening, after watching Dela unwrap yet another expensive gift with barely a word of thanks, Serwaa quietly approached her father. "Daddy," she asked softly, her small voice trembling slightly, "did I do something wrong?" Yaa looked down at her, genuinely confused. "Why would you ask that, my dear?" Serwaa lowered her eyes to the floor. "Sometimes I feel like Mommy doesn't love me the way she loves Dela." Something inside Yaa's chest broke quietly at those words. He knelt down and pulled her into a tight, protective hug. "Never think that, Serwaa," he said firmly. "Never. You are my daughter, and I love you very, very much." Serwaa nodded against his shoulder, comforted for the moment, but the questions never fully disappeared. As the two girls grew older, side by side, one blossomed into someone increasingly spoiled and self-centered, while the other quietly learned to endure disappointment with a grace far beyond her years. And although Serwaa could never quite articulate the feeling, she often found herself wondering, in the private silence of her own heart, whether she truly belonged in the family she had always called her own. As the years passed and the two girls grew into young women, the difference between them sharpened with every passing season, becoming impossible for anyone in their community to overlook. Serwaa grew into a kind-hearted, respectful, and remarkably hardworking young woman. She greeted everyone she met with a genuine smile. She treated both the young and the elderly with equal warmth and patience. Whenever someone in the neighborhood needed help, whether carrying heavy loads, tending to a sick relative, or simply needing someone to listen, Serwaa was always among the first to offer her assistance, freely and without complaint. Even when life dealt her unfair hands, she remained humble, grateful, and quietly resilient. People spoke highly of her wherever she went. Neighbors admired her diligence. Friends respected her sincerity. Even strangers found it remarkably easy to like her within moments of meeting her. "That girl has a good heart," people would often remark to one another. Any family would consider themselves fortunate to welcome her as a daughter-in-law. Serwaa would simply smile modestly and thank them, never allowing the praise to inflate her sense of self. Dela, too, grew into a striking young woman with undeniably beautiful features, a fact she was keenly, sometimes uncomfortably, aware of. Unfortunately, years of being indulged and shielded from consequence had shaped a character quite different from her sisters. She had come to believe, deep in her bones, that she deserved special treatment wherever she went. She looked down on those she considered beneath her station, and she grew visibly upset whenever circumstances failed to bend entirely in her favor. Whenever someone dared to correct her behavior, Amma rushed immediately to her defense. "My daughter has done nothing wrong," she would insist, even in situations where Dela's fault was plain for anyone to see. As a result, Dela rarely learned to accept responsibility for her own actions. She grew entitled, sharp-tongued, and increasingly difficult to please. And the more people praised Serwaa's gentle nature, the more bitterly Dela's resentment festered beneath her polished surface. At family gatherings, relatives often compared the two sisters aloud, entirely unaware of the quiet damage their careless words were inflicting. "Serwaa is such a wonderful young woman," one guest might remark warmly. "So respectful, so hardworking." Another would add, nodding in agreement, "Any man fortunate enough to marry her will surely be blessed." Dela would sit through these conversations with a forced, brittle smile plastered across her face, while fury simmered dangerously beneath the surface. After the guests finally departed, she would storm into her room and unleash her frustration on her mother. "Why does everyone always talk about Serwaa?" she demanded one particular evening, her voice sharp with wounded pride. "Am I simply invisible to these people?" Amma sighed heavily, though the sigh carried more sympathy for her daughter than concern for the unfairness being discussed. "People simply don't see your worth the way they should," she said. Dela crossed her arms tightly. "They act as though she is somehow better than me." Amma's expression hardened into something colder, more protective. "You are not less than anyone, Dela, especially not less than Serwaa." As the girls grew older still, the difference between them became even more pronounced. When young men began visiting the family home, some formally, some simply passing through under polite pretenses, many found themselves quietly drawn to Serwaa's gentle warmth. They admired her physical beauty, certainly, but it was her genuine kindness that truly captured and held their attention. Some expressed open interest in courting her. Others sent careful, respectful messages through mutual family friends. Dela noticed every single instance, and each compliment directed toward her sister landed like a fresh, deliberate insult. One particular afternoon, after yet another visitor had spent the majority of his time engaged in warm conversation with Serwaa rather than herself, Dela finally exploded in frustration once the guest had departed. "Why does this keep happening?" she demanded, pacing furiously. "Why does everyone always choose her over me?" Amma placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder, her voice softening into something almost conspiratorial. "Don't worry, my dear. Your time will come." But privately, quietly, something darker had already begun taking root in Amma's own heart. What had started years earlier as simple favoritism had slowly, almost imperceptibly, transformed into something far more dangerous. Mother and daughter began feeding each other's resentment in a closed, poisonous loop. Whenever Dela complained, Amma offered encouragement rather than correction. Whenever Amma expressed her own quiet bitterness, Dela eagerly agreed. Together, mother and daughter convinced themselves, night after night, that Serwaa was somehow stealing attention and affection that rightfully belonged to Dela alone. Neither of them wanted to admit the far simpler, far more painful truth, that people loved Serwaa because of the genuine goodness woven into her character, not because of any injustice done to Dela. Instead, they chose to blame Serwaa for every disappointment either of them experienced. The bond between mother and daughter grew increasingly dangerous, their private conversations circling obsessively around Serwaa's perceived faults. Their frustration compounded year after year. And without either of them fully realizing the depth of what was happening, both women were slowly, steadily allowing jealousy to poison something essential inside their hearts. While bitterness quietly festered within one corner of the family, something beautiful was preparing to enter Serwaa's life entirely unannounced. One ordinary day, Serwaa met a man named Kwaku. Their first encounter was completely unplanned, arriving through nothing more than simple chance. Yet from the very moment they exchanged their first words, an unmistakable connection sparked between them. Their conversation flowed with startling ease, as though they had somehow known each other for years rather than mere minutes. Kwaku found himself immediately drawn to Serwaa's warmth and unguarded sincerity. Serwaa, in turn, found herself quietly admiring his kindness and genuine humility. As they continued spending time together in the weeks that followed, their feelings deepened steadily. They spoke openly about their dreams, their private fears, and their hopes for whatever future might lie ahead. Every conversation drew them a little closer together. One quiet evening, sitting together beneath a sky scattered with stars, Kwaku turned to look at her with a gentle smile. "Do you know something?" he asked softly. Serwaa laughed, a light, easy sound. "What?" Kwaku shook his head slowly, his expression turning more thoughtful. "Every single day I spend with you only convinces me further that you are different from anyone I've ever known." Serwaa looked down, suddenly shy. "Different how?" "You have a good heart," he replied simply. "That is rarer than people realize." Serwaa smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that she couldn't quite name. Their relationship grew quickly from that point forward. The more Kwaku learned about Serwaa, her quiet strength, her humility, her remarkable ability to remain kind despite every hardship life had thrown at her, the more certain he became that she was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life beside. Eventually, his mind was made up entirely. He wanted to marry her. One day, Kwaku arrived at the family home to formally introduce himself and express his sincere intentions. Yaa welcomed him with genuine warmth, and from the very first moments of their conversation, he could see honest sincerity reflected clearly in the young man's eyes. After listening to Kwaku speak at length about Serwaa and his hopes for their future together, Yaa smiled with unmistakable pride. "You have my blessing," he said warmly. "All I have ever truly wanted is to see my daughter happy." Kwaku thanked him with genuine respect and gratitude. But while Yaa's heart swelled with joy, Amma and Dela experienced something entirely different. The moment they fully understood that Kwaku was not only sincere, but wealthy, handsome, successful, and deeply, unmistakably in love with Serwaa, jealousy tightened its cold grip around both their hearts simultaneously. After Kwaku finally departed that evening, Dela could barely contain her mounting frustration. "Why does she always get everything she wants?" she complained bitterly to her mother. Amma remained silent for a long, heavy moment before finally replying, her voice flat and cold. "Life is not fair." From that evening forward, the bitterness quietly consuming both women only continued to deepen. Wedding preparations soon began in earnest, filling the household with a flurry of activity. Family members celebrated the joyful news enthusiastically. Friends offered warm congratulations at every opportunity. Genuine excitement filled the household from morning until night. Every new arrangement seemed to bring fresh happiness to both Serwaa and Kwaku. Kwaku spared no effort in demonstrating his devotion, ensuring every detail of the ceremony reflected exactly how much Serwaa meant to him. Whenever she expressed even the smallest worry, he reassured her gently. Whenever she smiled, his own happiness deepened in response. Watching their relationship flourish so openly only fueled Dela's simmering envy further. Every gift Kwaku presented to Serwaa felt like another deliberate reminder of everything Dela believed she lacked. Every compliment directed toward her sister deepened the resentment coiled tightly inside her chest. While guests throughout the community eagerly anticipated a joyful, memorable wedding, Dela found herself increasingly consumed by an envy she could no longer control or rationalize away. And standing beside her the entire time, quietly encouraging those dangerous feelings rather than gently correcting them, was Amma. Neither woman fully understood, in those final weeks, that their compounding bitterness was steadily leading them toward a decision that would irrevocably alter all of their lives. As the wedding day drew nearer, excitement swelled in the hearts of nearly everyone surrounding Serwaa. Friends called daily to check on the preparations, their voices bright with anticipation. Relatives spoke enthusiastically about how beautiful the ceremony promised to be. Kwaku could hardly contain his eagerness to finally marry the woman he loved so completely. But while genuine happiness surrounded Serwaa on every side, a dangerous storm was quietly brewing inside Dela's heart, growing darker with each passing day. The closer the wedding drew, the more miserable Dela became. Every decoration hung throughout the house felt like a personal insult. Every congratulatory message that arrived felt like a fresh wound reopened. Every joyful smile on Serwaa's face only deepened the bitterness festering inside her. One evening, only a few days before the wedding, Dela sat alone in her room, tears streaming silently down her face. Amma walked in and found her staring blankly at the floor, shoulders trembling. "What is wrong?" Amma asked, settling beside her. Dela looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Everything is wrong," she replied, her voice cracking. "My entire life has felt unfair." "What do you mean?" Amma asked gently. Dela wiped angrily at her tears. "Serwaa always gets everything. Everyone praises her. Everyone adores her. Every good thing in this world seems to happen to her, and only her. And now she's marrying a man like Kwaku, while I have absolutely nobody." Amma listened in silence as her daughter's frustration poured out in an unbroken stream. A loving, wise mother would have gently corrected her daughter in that moment. A truly caring mother would have reminded her that jealousy only ever destroys the one who carries it. But instead, something shifted visibly in Amma's expression, her features hardening into something colder. "You are right," she said quietly. Dela looked up sharply. "What?" Amma nodded slowly, deliberately. "You are entirely right. Sometimes life has simply not been fair to you." Dela's eyes widened with something between shock and vindication. "So you see it too? You've felt it too?" Amma sighed deeply, a sound heavy with years of buried resentment finally surfacing. "Ever since Serwaa entered this family," she admitted, "everything has revolved around her." Their conversation continued deep into the night, growing darker with every exchanged word. Instead of confronting their own private bitterness, honestly, mother and daughter chose instead to blame Serwaa entirely for their unhappiness. They convinced each other, with growing conviction, that she was somehow personally responsible for everything they felt they lacked. With every sentence exchanged between them, their shared jealousy compounded further, until finally, a terrible idea began forming in both their minds simultaneously. At first, neither woman spoke the thought aloud, but eventually, Dela broke the heavy silence between them. "What if the wedding never happens?" she asked quietly. Amma turned to look at her daughter directly. Neither woman spoke for several long, suspended seconds. Then, slowly, deliberately, Amma finally answered. "If there's no wedding," she said, "there's no marriage." Dela's breathing quickened noticeably. "Exactly." A dangerous, unsettling smile spread slowly across Amma's face. Before that terrible night finally ended, the two of them had made their decision. The wedding would not take place, no matter what it ultimately took to stop it. On the evening before the wedding, the entire house buzzed with activity. Everyone busied themselves with final preparations, checking and rechecking every detail. Serwaa moved through the rooms with visible excitement tangled together with nervous energy. She could barely bring herself to eat anything substantial. She spoke constantly about Kwaku and the future they would soon build together as husband and wife. As she sat quietly in the dining area that evening, lost in happy thoughts, Dela secretly exchanged a knowing glance with her mother across the room. Earlier that same day, the two of them had quietly obtained a substance specifically designed to induce many hours of deep, uninterrupted sleep. When no one else was paying attention, it was carefully added to Serwaa's drink. Completely unaware of the deception, Serwaa lifted the glass and drank without hesitation. Within a short time, an unusual heaviness began settling over her. "I don't know why I feel so sleepy," she remarked, rubbing her eyes with growing confusion. Amma forced a sympathetic smile onto her face. "You've been under so much stress with all these wedding preparations. Go and get some proper rest, my dear." Serwaa nodded slowly, her eyelids already growing heavy. "You're probably right." She hugged her father goodnight, her movements sluggish, and made her way toward her bedroom. Within minutes of lying down upon her bed, she sank into an unusually deep, dreamless sleep. Hours later, long after the rest of the household had settled into silence, Amma and Dela quietly crept toward Serwaa's bedroom door and eased it open. They stepped inside carefully, their eyes immediately drawn to the beautiful wedding gown hanging nearby, illuminated faintly by moonlight streaming through the window. The gown represented everything they had come to resent. It represented Serwaa's happiness. It represented her future, her love, her escape into a life they believed she had never truly earned or deserved. Dela smiled wickedly in the darkness. "This is it, Mother." Amma nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Let me see how you will get married tomorrow, Serwaa," she whispered into the quiet room. Without another word passing between them, she withdrew a small lighter from her pocket. The flame flickered weakly at first in the darkness before steadying. Dela snatched the gown down from its hanger and held it aloft. The fire caught the delicate fabric almost instantly. Flames erupted upward, growing higher and higher with terrifying speed, swallowing the beautiful white gown that had been prepared with so many months of careful love and attention. The expensive fabric crackled and hissed as it burned, curling into blackened ash before their very eyes. Rather than feeling panic or remorse, the two women stood watching and laughed quietly together in the darkness. Amma glanced toward her sleeping daughter and whispered, with unmistakable cruelty, "You will never get married before my daughter." Dela laughed harder still, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Let me see how you will get married before your sister. She will never get married before me." The flames climbed higher, consuming months of careful preparation in mere minutes. Yet Serwaa remained fast asleep through it all, utterly unaware of the nightmare unfolding just steps from where she lay dreaming. When Serwaa finally woke the following morning, the sun had already climbed high into the sky. She stretched slowly, feeling a strange, unfamiliar heaviness lingering in her limbs. For one brief, peaceful moment, she smiled, her mind still half lost in thoughts of her approaching wedding day. Then her eyes drifted toward where her gown should have been hanging. The dress was gone. Only a scattered pile of ash remained where it had once hung. Serwaa's eyes widened in immediate horror. A scream tore from her throat before she could stop it. Her mother rushed into the room moments later, her expression carefully arranged into practiced shock. "What happened?" she asked, her voice pitched with feigned innocence. Serwaa pointed a trembling finger toward the ashes scattered across the floor. Her hands shook uncontrollably. "My dress," she gasped. "It's gone. Someone destroyed it." Amma pressed a hand to her chest, her performance of horror nearly flawless. "Who could possibly have done such a terrible thing? This is awful. I simply cannot believe this has happened." The devastating news spread quickly through the household and beyond. The wedding had to be postponed immediately. Kwaku arrived at the house within the hour, utterly devastated by what he found. He took Serwaa's trembling hands in his own, promising her gently that they would marry soon, regardless of this cruel setback. "I don't understand what happened, Kwaku," Serwaa cried, tears streaming freely down her face. "Someone burned my dress. Someone deliberately wanted to destroy our wedding, our happiness." "Don't worry," he whispered, pulling her close. "We will find out exactly who did this. I promise you that." But deep within her heart, some quiet, long-buried part of Serwaa already suspected the truth. She had always sensed, in ways she could never quite articulate, that her mother and sister harbored resentment toward her. She had always known, on some level, that they had tried in smaller ways to diminish her happiness over the years. Now, finally, undeniably, she had proof. That evening, once the household had finally settled into an uneasy, grief-stricken silence, Serwaa made her way quietly to the local police station and gave her full statement, her voice steady despite the heartbreak still raw in her chest. When the truth of what had happened finally emerged into the light, the entire community was left utterly shocked. Amma and Dela were both arrested within days, and following a swift, thoroughly documented investigation, they were both convicted for their crime. Every story carries within it a lesson worth remembering if we are willing to sit with its weight long enough to learn from it. Jealousy does not only wound the person it is directed toward, it destroys, just as completely, the one who chooses to carry it. Amma and Dela allowed their envy to consume them entirely, poisoning every relationship it touched. They believed, in their darkest moment, that they were only hurting Serwaa. In truth, they were destroying themselves as well, piece by piece, choice by choice. In their hearts, Jealousy transformed slowly into a poison that ultimately consumed everything good that remained within them. Serwaa forgave them, eventually. Not because either of them deserved her forgiveness, but because she understood, with a wisdom far beyond her years, that carrying hatred forward would only destroy her own heart in return. She married Kwaku not long after, and together they built a beautiful, honest life grounded in the very kindness that had once made her a target for jealousy rather than a source of shame. But she never forgot what had happened. She never forgot that the people meant to love us most deeply are sometimes, tragically, the very ones capable of hurting us most profoundly. Serwaa chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to build her life upon kindness rather than bitterness. And she never allowed the hatred of others to define who she ultimately became. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Afrok-Drama Diaries for more stories that will make you think, feel, and remember what truly matters. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been hurt by someone who was supposed to love you? We read every single comment. Every story has a lesson. See you in the next one.